I remember the sound of the shovel hitting the dirt before I even saw him. That scraping sound, metal against roots, against packed earth. It carried across the yard in the dark the way sounds do in late summer, when everything is still and the air is thick and there's nothing else to drown it out. At first, I thought it was just someone clearing brush in the woods behind my house. People did that sometimes. The neighbors on the far end of Whitmore Lane, the Pattersons, they used to go back there in the evenings to clear deadfall after a storm. It wasn't unusual to hear something from those trees. But then I looked out the window more carefully, and when he looked over his shoulder, I realized he didn't want anyone to see him. I stood at my kitchen window for a long time after that, just standing there with my hands around my mug, not moving, watching, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Now, if you've spent any time with me in my little stories, you already know that strange things seem to find their way into my quiet life. I don't go looking for them. I never did. They just arrive, like uninvited guests who knock on the wrong door. If you enjoy hearing these true memories from an old woman who's seen more than she expected, go ahead and subscribe. I share these things because I think sometimes the strangest stories come from the quietest places, and Lord knows I've had a quiet life. Because what happened that night and in the weeks that followed still gives me chills. Even now, even telling it to you from this chair with the afternoon light coming through the curtains. Even now. Oh, forgive me. I suppose I should say who's talking. My name is Elizabeth May. I'm 85 years old now, and I've lived in this house on Whitmore Lane for going on 53 years. Came here with my husband Gerald when our youngest was still in diapers. Gerald's been gone 11 years. The children are scattered, one in Portland, one down in Georgia. And me, well, I stayed. I always figured I'd leave eventually, maybe move closer to one of the kids. But then the years kept going, and the house kept needing things, and I kept finding reasons not to go. Truth is, I love this house. I love the back porch. I love the way the light comes through those big oaks in the morning. I love the way the neighborhood sounds in summer. Kids on bikes, lawn mowers in the distance, screen doors banging shut. It's a good neighborhood. It always has been. That's part of why what I'm about to tell you unsettled me so deeply. You don't expect something like this in a place like this, in a life like mine. Let me tell you about those woods first, because you need to understand them to understand what I saw. The tree line starts maybe 40, 50 yards behind my backyard fence. Gerald used to say it was about 100 feet, but Gerald had a way of rounding things up. It's not a vast forest by any means, maybe a quarter-mile deep before it hits the back of the old industrial park on Route 9. But from the house, from the back windows, it looks like it goes on forever at night. Just dark trees, branches moving, nothing you can see clearly past the first row of trunks. In the daytime, it's beautiful. It really is. Dogwoods in the spring, leaves turning in October, the occasional deer moving along the edge in the early morning. We used to see foxes back there, too, when the children were small. Gerald would wake them up before school sometimes just to watch. But at night, it changes, the way any wooded area changes at night. It becomes something you look at differently, something you don't walk into without a flashlight and a good reason. I'd lived beside those woods for decades. I knew their sounds. I knew what belonged there and what didn't. And what I heard that August night, that rhythmic scraping, that digging, didn't belong. It was a Wednesday. I remember that because I'd been watching my program. I used to watch a nature documentary series on Wednesday evenings, had done it for years, and it had just ended. It was somewhere around 9:30, maybe 10 o'clock. I'd gotten up to bring my tea mug to the kitchen and rinse it out before bed. The kitchen window faces the backyard. I keep the light above the sink on at night, just a small one. It's not bright enough to illuminate much, but it's enough that I can see the yard if I stand close to the glass. I wasn't planning to look. I was just rinsing the mug, but the sound stopped me. Scraping, then a thud, then scraping again. I turned off the faucet and stood very still. The crickets were going the way they do in August, that constant lead sound they make that you stop hearing after a while. But underneath the crickets, I could hear it clearly. Someone digging. A slow, deliberate rhythm. Not frantic, not hurried, patient. I leaned toward the window and looked out. The yard was dark, but I could see the fence at the back, and just past it, at the tree line, there was a figure. A man, I thought, though I couldn't be certain at first. It was the shape of him, the way he moved, that made me think so. He was wearing dark clothing. He had a long-handled shovel, and he was digging into the ground at the edge of the trees. I watched for a moment, telling myself it was nothing, telling myself there was a reasonable explanation. And then he stopped. He straightened up slowly and turned his head, looking back toward the houses, looking toward mine, or in the direction of it anyway. Even from that distance, even in that darkness, something about the way he looked made my stomach drop. It wasn't a casual glance of someone who'd heard a noise. It was the careful scanning look of someone making sure they hadn't been seen. I stepped back from the window. I don't even know why. Instinct, I suppose. I stood there in my dark kitchen with my heart going and waited. After a moment, I looked again. He had gone back to digging. I want to be honest with you about what went through my mind because I think it matters. My first thought wasn't something sinister. My first thought was, maybe it's one of the Patterson boys. They were always doing something in those woods, building things, clearing things. One of them had even dug a drainage trench back there a few summers before, though that was in broad daylight and with his father standing nearby. But the Pattersons were on the other side. This man, whoever he was directly behind my property, and it was nearly 10 at night. My second thought was, maybe it's an animal thing. Maybe someone had a dog or a cat that died, and they were burying it back there, away from their own yard for some reason. People did strange things when they were grieving. I'd heard of it. That thought made me feel a little better for about 30 seconds, And then I thought, but why back there? Why in the dark? Why not in their own yard or a pet cemetery or any number of places a person would normally go? I stood at that window for close to 20 minutes. I want you to understand that. I didn't call anyone. I didn't go outside. I just stood there watching, trying to figure out what I was seeing. He dug for a while, then he stopped. He lifted something. I couldn't see what. It was too dark and too far, and placed it in the hole. He stood there for a moment, just standing, and then he began filling the hole back in. When he was done, he tamped the earth down with the back of the shovel, slowly, deliberately. Then he walked back into the trees and disappeared. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that. Finally, I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. You know, I've thought about that night many times over the years, wondered what I should have done differently in those first moments, whether I should have turned the porch light on, whether that would have frightened him off or just made him aware of me, whether I should have called the police right then and there. But what would I have said? I watched someone digging in the woods behind my house? I was 73 years old at the time. I lived alone. I second-guessed myself the way people do when they're not sure whether they're seeing something real or something their tired old mind had made more dramatic than it was. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. You start to wonder whether you can trust your own perceptions, whether what you saw was really what you saw. It's a terrible kind of self-doubt, and it's very easy to fall into it when you're sitting alone in a quiet house at 10 o'clock at night. So I waited. I told myself I'd see how I felt about it in the morning. In the morning, it didn't feel less strange. If anything, it felt stranger, the way things do when you've slept on them and they haven't faded the way you hoped. I went out to the back porch with my coffee and looked toward the tree line. Everything looked ordinary. The trees stood the way they always did. The yard was wet with dew. A cardinal was at the feeder, but I found myself studying that spot at the edge of the woods, and even from the porch, even in the daylight, I thought I could see it, a slight disturbance in the ground, a darker patch of earth where something had been turned over. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I wanted to see it. I didn't go back there. I thought about it. Part of me very much wanted to go back there and look at the ground, but I didn't. I couldn't say exactly why. Fear, maybe, or some older instinct that said, don't go near that place, not yet. I went about my days. I watched my programs. I had my sister Lorraine over for lunch that Friday. She drove up from Merrillville. She does that every few weeks. And I almost told her what I'd seen. I had the words right there. But I looked at Lorraine's face across the table, at her practical, sensible expression, and I thought about how it would sound. I saw a man digging in the woods at night, and I didn't know what he buried. It sounds like something, saying it now, but back then, in the daylight at my kitchen table with a chicken salad sandwich in front of me, it sounded like the beginning of a story a confused old woman tells. so I kept it to myself. A week passed, maybe 10 days, and then one evening I turned on the local news. They were doing a story, a missing person, a man named Dennis Calloway, 54 years old, from a town called Brixton, about 20 minutes east of us. He'd been reported missing by his wife 11 days prior. She'd said he left for work on a Tuesday morning and never came home. His car had been found at a commuter lot off Route 9. Route 9, right behind the industrial park, right behind those woods. I sat very still watching that report. They showed his picture, a gray heavy-set man with gray mustache and glasses standing at what looked like a backyard cookout, smiling. He looked like somebody's uncle. He looked utterly ordinary. They said police were asking anyone with information to come forward. I sat with that for a long time. You know, when you get to my age, your instincts get sharper. People think it's the opposite, that you get slower, more confused, more easily rattled, and maybe that's true in some ways, but in other ways, you've simply lived long enough to know when something is wrong, when a feeling in your stomach means something. And my instincts kept telling me that what I'd seen that night in those woods was connected to what I was watching on the news. I didn't know how. I didn't know if the man I'd seen was responsible for something, or was simply a witness to something, or was doing something else entirely that had nothing to do with Dennis Calloway. I didn't know any of it, but I knew I had to call. I want to tell you that calling felt easy, that I picked up the phone, reported what I saw, and felt certain I was doing the right thing. But I'd be lying. I sat with the phone in my hand for close to an hour. I went through every version of the conversation in my head. I imagined the officer on the other end, some young person maybe, trying to be patient with an elderly woman who was calling about something she'd seen 10 days ago in the dark from her kitchen window. I imagined how uncertain I would sound, because I was uncertain. I still was. But I called. The woman who answered was kind. She listened. She asked me to describe what I'd seen, the time, the location, the figure, what I thought I'd observed. She asked whether I recognized the man, whether I could describe him beyond what I'd seen. I told her I couldn't. It was too dark, too far. Dark clothing, tall, the way he moved, that was all I had. She thanked me and said someone would follow up. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen and felt, of all things, embarrassed, like I'd just called the fire department because I smelled smoke that turned out to be a neighbor's barbecue. 2 days later, a detective came to my door. His name was Greer. Detective Carl Greer, he said, handing me a card. He was maybe 40, 45, broad-shouldered, quiet-spoken. He had the kind of face that gives nothing away, which I suppose is useful in his line of work. He asked if he could come in, and I said, of course. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I almost told Lorraine, and I told him everything I've told you. The sound of the shovel, the figure at the tree line, the way the man had looked back, the careful, deliberate way he'd filled the hole back in. Detective Greer wrote things down. He asked me to show him from the window approximately where he thought the man had been digging. I pointed as well as I could. He asked whether I'd gone back to look at the site myself. I said no. He asked why not. I thought about it for a moment, and I said because I was afraid of what I might find. He looked at me for a moment when I said that, just a long, quiet look, and then he nodded, like that was the right answer, like he understood it completely. They went into the woods the next morning. I watched from the back porch. I could not watch. There were 3 of them, Detective Greer and 2 uniformed officers. They had shovels and what I think were evidence bags. They were back there for a long time. I made myself go inside after a while. I couldn't just stand on the porch staring. I made tea. I tried to read. I kept checking the window. Around midday, I saw Detective Greer walking across my backyard toward the house. I met him at the back door before he could knock. His face was different, still controlled, still quiet, but different. He said they'd found something. He said he couldn't tell me everything right now, that it was an ongoing investigation. But he said what I'd reported was significant. He said they were grateful I'd called. He asked me to come down to the station in the next day or 2 to make a formal statement. I said I would. I asked him, and I don't know why I asked it. Maybe I just needed to hear something. I asked him, was it related to that man, the one on the news, Mr. Calloway? He looked at me for a moment. He said, we're looking into a number of possibilities, ma'am, which wasn't a no. I made my statement 2 days later. I sat in a small room with Detective Greer and a woman who typed while I talked. I went through it all again, slowly, as carefully as I could. I tried to remember every detail, the sound, the timing, the figure's height, the way he moved. I'd been thinking about it so much by then that I was worried I'd started embellishing things without meaning to, filling in details my memory hadn't actually captured. I tried to stay honest. I tried to say I don't know when I didn't know. Detective Greer was patient. He never pushed me toward a particular description or tried to put words in my mouth. That gave me some confidence in him. Afterward, he walked me to my car in the parking lot and he shook my hand. He said again that I'd done the right thing calling. I asked him directly, what did you find back there? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, evidence related to an ongoing investigation. I can't say more than that right now. I drove home. I sat in my driveway for a little while before going inside. The afternoon was hot, late August heat, and the cicadas were going. I remember that clearly, the sound of them and the way the light looked on the trees in my front yard. I felt very strange, not frightened exactly, not relieved either, something in between those things, something I don't quite have the right word for. The investigation went on for months. I won't pretend I had any real window into it. I didn't. I was a witness who had made a statement. I wasn't entitled to updates, and I didn't ask for them. I watched the local news the way you watch anything when you feel personally connected to it, closely, anxiously, reading between the lines of every brief report. About 6 weeks after I'd spoken to Detective Greer, there was a short item in the newspaper. A man had been arrested in connection with the disappearance of Dennis Calloway. The man's name wasn't familiar to me. He lived in a town 2 counties over. The article said very little. Evidence recovered from a wooded area. Ongoing investigation. Charges pending. It said Dennis Calloway's remains had been found. I folded the newspaper and set it down. I sat at the table for a long time. I've thought about that night many times since. I've gone over and over the sequence of it, the sound that stopped me at the sink, the figure at the tree line, the moment I stepped back from the window. What if I hadn't been awake? What if I'd gone to bed earlier, or my program had run long, or I'd rinsed my mug and turned away before I heard anything? Those woods might have stayed quiet. That ground might have stayed undisturbed. The man who was arrested might never have been found. Or maybe he would have. Maybe there was other evidence, other leads, other witnesses I know nothing about. I'm not so important as to think everything hinged on one old woman looking out her kitchen window. But maybe it mattered. That's the part I circle back to still, after all these years. I did speak to Detective Greer one more time about 8 months later. He called to let me know that the case had gone to trial and that a conviction had been obtained. He thanked me again. He said my account had been helpful in establishing the timeline and the location. He asked how I was doing. I said I was fine, which was mostly true. I asked him. I'd wondered for months, and I finally just asked. I said, the night I saw him, was he there long? Had he just arrived, or... Detective Greer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, based on what we were able to determine, you likely saw him within the first hour of him being there. I didn't ask anything else after that. I think I'd asked all I was able to ask. I still live in this house. I'm 85 now, and the children worry about me being alone, and I understand that. I have Lorraine close by. I have neighbors I trust. I have my routines. I still watch from the kitchen window in the evenings sometimes. The yard, the fence, the tree line. It looks the same as it always did. The oaks are taller, I think, though maybe I just notice them differently now. The deer still come to the edge of the woods in the early morning. On clear nights, you can see the first row of trees pretty well if the moon is up. On dark nights, you can't see much at all. I don't think about it every evening. That's not quite true. Not every evening. But sometimes, when the summer gets thick and still the way it does, and the crickets are loud, and the air doesn't move, sometimes I'll be standing at the sink, and I'll hear something from out there. A branch, the wind, something settling, and for just a moment I'll go very still. I'll stand with my hands around my mug, and I'll look toward those trees, and I'll remember. The sound of the shovel hitting the dirt, that slow, patient rhythm, the way he looked back over his shoulder in the dark. I've lived a long life, and most of it has been quiet, genuinely quiet, the kind of quiet that's a blessing, not just an absence. I'm grateful for that. I want you to know I'm grateful for that. But some things you see once and they stay with you. They just do. Not as a wound, not exactly. More like a watermark on paper. You can hold the page up to the light and it's always there. Faint, but always there. I saw a man bury something in the woods behind my house, and I did what I could with that. Some things you see once and never forget.